exactly 1 year ago when, through the course of a session on municipal stress and distress, that we had a very intriguing conversation about the great city of Detroit. And here we are, 1 year later, following the successful reorganization in record time. I don't think anybody would have 1 year ago expected that this reorganization could have been executed in this short amount of time. And we give credit to many of the individuals who are here with us today for that successful endeavor. Please join me in welcoming Carol Masser from Bloomberg, another veteran of this Palm Beach affair, to come and facilitate what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation.
I have to say that I was lucky enough to have dinner with almost everybody last night, and you're in for a treat because I kind of felt like a fly on the wall in what must have gone on for those 18 months during the Detroit restructuring and the bankruptcy, or the bankruptcy, I should say. Just a little bit of a backdrop, if I may. Detroit, believe it or not, you should believe it, was once the fourth largest city in the United States. Go back to the 50s and the 60s, it was the wealthiest city in America on a per capita income basis. It was, many consider, the greatest manufacturing city in the world, and it really was where everybody looked around the globe, kind of with a sense of awe and wonder in terms of what was going on in Detroit. On the afternoon of July 18, 2013, as you know, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, making it the largest city in the U.S. to seek court protection, not to mention probably the most complex. As for the woes, we all know the laundry list. Crime, white flight, political corruption, pension liabilities, decline of the auto industry, racial tensions, loss of manufacturing jobs. Here's a number for you. They went from around 350,000 in 1950 to 27,000 in 2012. Population had gone from about just under 2 million in 1950 to around 700,000 today, with about 42% living in poverty. A city with limited police and fire response, a city with broken streetlights, one of the many broken things in systems. A Bloomberg View columnist wrote, "No one factor pushed Detroit over the edge. They were the victims of decades of bad decisions and bad luck." At the time of the bankruptcy filing, the debt, restructuring some $18 billion in debt and other obligations. This panel, at the far end, on the edge, is Judge Stephen Rhodes, now retired, just retired, of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, who for 30 years, in his own words, says he's pretty much done it all and seen it all. He oversaw the Detroit bankruptcy and the plans to exit. Next to me, Heather Lennox, partner at Jones Day. Heather and the team at Jones Day were very key in the restructuring. They represented debtors. They served as the lead restructuring counsel to the city of Detroit in connection with that Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Next to Judge Rhodes is Vince Marriott, partner at Ballard Spahr. He and his firm represented a group of creditors, European banks holding some of Detroit's pension certificates. And then we have Ron Bloom in the middle, vice chairman of the U.S. investment banking firm Lazard, former member of the White House Auto Task Force that led to the reorganization of General Motors and Chrysler. I know something that's been a topic over the years here at this event. He was also a financial advisor to the court-appointed committee representing retirees in the bankruptcy case. These are the key players. So let's start with the reality in assessing the damage, because these guys had to kind of set me straight a little bit. We know that Detroit was distressed, but I don't think everybody really knew the full figures. Heather, I think when you said, as the information came to light, I mean, it was shocking.
It was shocking. I mean, we knew, everybody from the outside knew it was bad, but we didn't know how bad it was until we got in. First of all, the deficits that we actually found were probably twice what was being reported. The level of erosion and deterioration that the city's infrastructures had experienced, I don't think the IT system had been updated since the 1970s. It's that kind of thing. I mean, the police vehicles, you know, the policeman would have to go under the cars and jimmy the wires to try to get the police cars to start. At any given time, like a third of the EMS vehicles weren't running. It was way worse than I think anybody thought or anybody really knew.
Hey, Ron, I think you said to me it was kind of daunting when you kind of got into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we didn't see anything different than Heather. We got there first, but we certainly not see it any differently. I think the daunting aspect of it, though, is to go back to the factors you enunciated earlier, is the core economics of the city weren't working. I mean, if you look at how many people are working in Detroit, the average wage of people who are working there, the average property values, you can have a broken company, but if it has EBITDA, if it has something underneath it that can drive, it has an economic engine, you find a way to fix it. But Detroit's problem, I would argue, at essence, was that its economic engine was broken. And that without employment, without good jobs, those sorts of things, I think that's an overlay, that's a context on it that makes it extremely difficult when you get the size of liabilities and the level of political disrepair.
So Vince, when you came into it, we were talking about, you guys kind of laughed just about those questionable deals and how they got done, as he rolls his eyes. I mean, when you come into that situation, you've got, a situation you're dealing with, and then you see the backdrop. How did those questionable deals get done?
Well, let me explain what my clients held. They held what were called certificates of participation. And at essence, what these instruments did, they were a means of refinancing part of the unfunded pension liability of the two pension systems that were maintained by the city of Detroit. And the deals were done in two tranches in 2005 and 2006. And the characterization of those deals in the case was, in many respects, as the straw that broke the camel's back. That these deals were bad deals for the city and ultimately drove it, if not the cause of bankruptcy, an accelerator of bankruptcy. I mean, I take issue with that and really for the following reason. The COPS transactions did not increment the city's total obligations. It was not as though the city had come up with a scheme by which it could borrow additional funds beyond that which it already owed, and thereby increase the debt burden of the city. What it did was, in effect, take an obligation the city already had owed to its retirees. And it did two things. It transferred the risk of default from those retirees to my clients, which I think, from the retirees' perspective, is a good thing. I'm not sure that had there been $1.5 billion of additional unfunded pension liability at the time Detroit filed bankruptcy, that the grand bargain and the other pieces of the pension fix would have worked. The other thing that the COPS transaction did was reduce the interest rate at which that obligation was bearing interest from 7.8% to 7.9%, depending upon the pension plan, to between 4% and 6%, depending upon whether it was fixed rate debt or floaters with a swap. In either event, the annual interest cost to the city dropped from about $110 million on this obligation to about $70. So we viewed ourselves as the first rescuers of the pension plan, not as the bad guys who torpedoed the city. I never got the chance to really make that argument because that issue got ultimately resolved. And were Judge Rhodes and I to have a discussion about that, it might look a little bit like the venue discussion from earlier, which gave me podium flashback, not on this issue, but on some others. But when we came into the case, another thing I think is worth mentioning is that there was a big eligibility fight at the beginning of the case. And the capital markets participants did not oppose eligibility. We thought at the time that bankruptcy was critical for the city. And but I will say this: when I first came to Detroit, it was the first time I'd ever been in Detroit, and I didn't even have to see under the hood to realize what a disaster Detroit had become. All you had to do was walk out into the middle of downtown in the middle of the day, and you could see that Detroit was in serious, serious trouble. And we quickly learned what Heather mentioned about the dilapidation of the information systems and financial controls when we started asking for information to get under the hood ourselves. And for a long time, the city just couldn't give it to us. They couldn't get it, and so they couldn't give it to us. And it was an enormously frustrating first 6 or 8 months of the case because we were all groping for what might work with billions of dollars in a city at stake and struggling with the inability to get the sort of information you would need to make intelligent decisions about which direction the case should go.
Well, and that brings me to Judge Rhodes. I mean, in terms of the reality of the situation in Detroit and how bad it was, how did that complicate what you had to do?
I was barraged with all kinds of statistics about how bad Detroit was. But I also knew that there was a human element behind all of this that had to be brought out, that wasn't conveyed by simply looking at numbers. And so I invited members of the public to participate in the proceeding and to talk to me about their feelings about the bankruptcy. There was a lot of anger in the city about the appointment of the emergency manager and about the filing of the bankruptcy case and the perception that the state had unnecessarily allowed this to happen. And in the course of those discussions with those people, they would relay stories to me about how this thing we sort of call service delivery insolvency. It's kind of a sterile term, but the real impact that this had on the lives of real people was just shocking. The stories they would tell about the harm and injury they would suffer because the city couldn't respond in the way we expect our cities to respond.
For years.
Yeah, that's right. So I realized early on that as a Chapter 9 case, this was as much a political case as a legal case, because everything we would do in this case would have an impact on the city, on the region, and even on the state. And that's unlike, of course, most Chapter 11 cases.
And that's something, you know, the human level and the level of acrimony, I think you pointed out, Heather, that was kind of shocking to you when you got there. And actually, you're not from the area. When you got on the ground, the discord between so many different groups within Detroit.
Yeah, not only within Detroit, but within the surrounding communities. The political atmosphere there was so toxic. It was definitely Detroit, which is probably 80 to 85% African American at this point, with the surrounding communities, which are largely white. And there was very much a discourse of us versus them, a lot of finger pointing and really scandalous kinds of accusations, some of which may have had a little grain of truth back and forth. But even the discourse within the city, it was a very fractious kind of discourse, and lots of different opinions very strongly held, some more fact-based than others, and trying to push through all of that political dynamic, which had been there for decades, to try to come to some kind of consensual resolution that people could buy into on a global basis was incredibly challenging. So, incredibly challenging.
Ron, you said something to me on a conference call that it was like going to a picnic of a large, fractious family for the first time.
Look, the city'd been in decline for a long, long time, and the human beings who were in charge of both the city and the region, the state, had been arguing about Detroit's decline for a long, long time. You know, every couple of years there'd be a new revitalization plan, a new something about how the new fresh start was going to happen. And so the level of cynicism that people would have and the amount of finger pointing that people would have about how we got to where we got to was long. And so we all came in and looked at this stuff and said, wow, the people in Detroit have been living this for 50 years and have been living these disagreements and these arguments and this blaming. And the dilemma I think that raises for a Chapter 9 case is, as Judge Rhodes said, this is a kind of a political process. And the fact that the people in charge of the various stakeholder groups in the city, many of them couldn't talk to each other, many of them blamed each other, were still arguing about things that happened 20, 30 years ago, meant that trying to build a consensus around what was right was very difficult, because people were still fighting old wars and still debating old debates. And sort of we all came in with fresh eyes, but until you really stopped and appreciated that the people who'd been living this decline for a long time had passionately held views about why it happened, and therefore what the proper solution was, until you ingested that, it was very hard to figure out what a path forward could be.
I mean, it wasn't just dealing with the creditors, the debtors. I mean, it was the rights of the citizens.
Right. I mean, to me, the sort of, and Judge Rose alluded to this, but, you know, I've spent most of my time in Chapter 11s, and the rule in Chapter 11, of course, is equity goes last. But in Detroit, at least the way I thought about it, was the citizens are the equity. I mean, who else is the equity? And how do you tell, and does the equity have rights? What is the proper right? What is the proper level of police protection that an American deserves? Do we have any kind of inherent right as citizens of this country, citizens of the state of Michigan, of the city of Detroit, to some level of police protection? What is our citizenship right? And that's the equity voice. And so figuring out how to mediate between the very important rights of creditors, and we represented creditors, so obviously we were passionate about that. But you couldn't ignore the equity here. You couldn't do what a Chapter 11 does, which is say, the equity, you're gone. Now we're just going to worry about giving the company to the creditors. That's not an answer in a Chapter 9. And I think that, in some ways, is the most interesting challenge of the case.
I think the personal aspects of this, the citizenry, I think had two meaningful impacts from my perspective. The first was Judge Rhodes and I had a lot of spirited exchanges at the podium, but I only had one moment of panic in the case. And the moment of panic was early on when we were dealing with a public lighting authority proposed bond issue that the city had come to Judge Rhodes seeking approval of. And the money was going to be used to replace streetlights. And many of them were out in neighborhoods which were unsafe enough as it was without adequate lighting. And so the notion was that this money would be borrowed and these lights would start to be replaced. I think at the end of the day, it all got hijacked by politics like everything else, and there were disputes about where you would start, and it ended up. But I got up and I objected to it, and I objected to it on the basis, in part, that the city really hadn't yet figured out what it was going to do with the debt it already had. Here it was talking about layering on new debt without figuring out how much money would be needed for a stabilized path forward. Was this really the order in which you should be doing things? And Judge Rhodes said to me, well, but how do you respond to the argument that lack of these streetlights, I mean, people could die. And I immediately, right there at the podium, saw in front of me the Detroit Free Press headline, "European banks don't care if people die." And
At Bloomberg, we would never do that, I'm just telling you.
And I forget exactly how I answered that question, but it was fortunately in a way that there was no headline. But it was a factor in sort of thinking through everything that was going on in the case. And as Ron indicates, that is a dynamic entirely missing, usually from Chapter 11. The other way it played in was, and this was particular to Michigan, and the emergency manager law, the effect of which was to remove control of the city from its elected officials and therefore from its citizens. And this sort of anti-democratic, although in the situation of Detroit probably necessary, but this sort of anti-democratic overlay required, I think, number one, the speed with which Judge Rhodes conducted the case, because there was always a tension between getting it done but returning the city to its citizens. And the other piece of it was that there was some issue about, and by the way, I was one of the complainers about how fast the case was moving. But the fact of the matter is that if the city had stayed in bankruptcy longer, with the objective of having some of the revitalization efforts conducted within the bankruptcy, to be sure that they were going to work, you would have had, again, the problem of buy-in. It was important at the end of the day that the citizens of the city of Detroit ultimately do what needed to be done to save the city of Detroit. Had it been done by an anti-democratic appointed emergency manager, then I'm not sure that it would have stuck. And whether it works or not, we don't know. It's going to be a decade before we know.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned revitalization, and that was a necessary component, wasn't it, as a part of this process, Heather?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of restructuring a city is to allow the city to do what it's supposed to do, which is provide basic municipal services to its citizenry. And Detroit was clearly failing in that. Now, so Chuck's team really took the lead in delving into the weeds of the operations and trying to figure out what could be done to fix the operations, where would we have to invest new money. The city was incredibly blighted, and fortunately there had been a blight task force starting to analyze this stuff, and blight is a huge accelerant to the crime statistics.
And there's battles, I know, in just getting rid of the blight. I know there were people who were taking care of it, and then the city's taking care of it.
Yeah, I think
like a Pulte grandson was helping out.
Those largely got worked out, I think, through the blight task force.
But it's never easy.
No,
Right.
nothing's ever easy.
No.
But to everybody's credit, the creditors, the retirees, Ron's clients, Vince's clients, everybody understood that Detroit was in such bad shape that there had to be some money coming off the revenue stream right off the top to start reinvesting in the city, to upgrade the IT to something that looks remotely like today's standards, to replace the fleet vehicles for the public safety services, to start training for the employees that, Chuck was right, were woefully unprepared for the jobs they were supposed to be doing.
Judge Rhodes, from your perspective and watching the debate, did people get it?
Well, it was very challenging, not only from the negotiation perspective, but from my perspective as the judge in the case. There's a legal and even a constitutional overlay to this whole discussion. Mm-hmm. And it arises because Chapter 9 is not formally a reorganization provision in the sense that you understand Chapter 11 is. It is strictly a debt adjustment process. We're not really formally or strictly part of the plan of adjustment. Actually, they're not even in the plan, right? They're in the disclosure statement.
Right.
Right.
But
But it was a big
because of the bankruptcy code, the bankruptcy court really has no jurisdiction over the property of the city, the revenues of the city, the political decisions that the city makes. So all of this restructuring, municipal restructuring and revitalization is still in the hands of the city and outside of the jurisdiction of the bankruptcy court. And there's a constitutional basis for that in the 10th Amendment as well. So Ron raised the question about the extent to which it was appropriate to question the city's judgments as we went through the case. And I always needed to be convinced that the court really had any role to play in that whatsoever. Fortunately, I never really had to decide that because everyone wound up settling, but that was a deeply troubling and challenging question legally for me throughout the case.
Ron, your perspective, and then to talk about the revitalization, the importance of it, and then you also serving your constituency.
Yeah, so a couple points that frame it from the retirees' perspective. First thing, just to give some context, the retiree claims between pension and health care were roughly 85% of all unsecured claims in the case. So this really is about what do you do with these promises you made to the retirees. Second observation, the retirees, while there were individual examples of people who gamed the system or something, as a whole, we're not living high on the hog. The average pension for a general retiree was $19,000, and for a cop or a firefighter was 30 grand, and they didn't get Social Security. So nobody was getting rich on this from the retirees' perspective.
But you add it all up, and it's a lot.
But there are a lot of them, absolutely. So the problem is not the per capita, the problem is the number of capitas. But the retirees are not responsible for the fact that there are a lot of capitas. The city shrunk a lot. And so as it shrunk a lot, it had an inverted pyramid that represented its promises to its retirees. So as I said earlier, the real dilemma for the retirees, and then the other overlay point is 2/3 of the retirees live in southeastern Michigan, and many of them in the city of Detroit. And if they don't live there, they have family there. So in some ways, this is a kind of an inter-house debate about what to do. The piece that hasn't been mentioned that I think, however, was just glancingly mentioned that I'd like to bring to this, however, and it goes again to the politics of this. So I think there's great justice in the fact that the citizens of Detroit need the revitalization. They need their government to work better for them. I'm not making a legal point. There's great justice in that. In my judgment, there's equal justice and some legal points to be made about the promises you make to retirees. And let's agree that those two just can't easily connect. The numbers don't add up. There were 3 elements of the case that were purely political. And I'm not saying they had no legal aspect to them, but at the end of the day, they were judgments about the politics of Michigan and the politics of southeastern Michigan. So the city had an art museum that some people say was worth $5 billion, maybe more. And do the citizens of Detroit need to honor the promises to the retirees, to have police protection, or to have a world-class art museum? In a perfect world, they should have all 3. But what is the right answer? I'm not making a legal judgment. I'm asking, what is the right answer for this fabulous art museum that was acquired, much of it, with city funds? So with taxpayer money, these paintings were bought, many of them. And what is the obligation there? And the resolution on that was a political resolution. The city owned a water department. And the resolution of that water department, again, was a political decision about what was feasible. And there were early attempts to get a lot of money out of the water department. At the end of the day, no money was functionally received from the water, no substantial money was received. Again, I'm not saying this wasn't done in a legal context, but at the end of the day, that was a political judgment. And then finally, what's the obligation of the state of Michigan? The state of Michigan did participate. They put in roughly $200 million. Is that the right amount? And again, there's no truth to that question. There's no legal, you can't find in the law books that the city of Michigan, a population of this, owes the city of Detroit a population of that. Chuck mentioned the revenue sharing declines, which led to the decline overall. So should the city of Michigan put in $2 million? Should it have put in $1 billion? What is the obligation of the city to a political subdivision, a state to a political subdivision of the state? So on the one side, you had an irreconcilable problem of the citizenry absolutely deserving, and no one could possibly with a straight face say that these people were anything but horridly underserved. You had, again, in significant measure, really promises to retirees. There were other obligations, but they added up to 15% or 18% of the total. And those two, I don't think there's any question, those two don't match. But the resolution of the case and how it ended really was, as I said, based on political decisions about those three other issues.
I never thought that reconciling the retiree claims with the service delivery requirements of the city was so impossible as Ron might suggest here. And the reason for that is the basic premise that unless the city was able to provide adequate municipal services and thereby to attract residents and businesses, it was never going to be able to fulfill its promises to its retirees. It was only its commitment to fulfill its municipal service obligations that allowed it, that would allow it, to fulfill its obligations to its creditors.
But Judge Rhodes, does an art museum, I think it's important for cities to have art museums.
Thank you.
I
So
do.
did the city.
But I'm just saying, I could see from a creditor's perspective or debtor's perspective to say, is that going to really make a big difference in Detroit's long-term future?
So let's
I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit.
So let's talk about that, okay? Ron's right. There were some, or a valuation that placed the value of the art at $5 billion. We had Christie's look at the most valuable pieces that comprised 80% of the worth of the collection. And the range was between 400 some and 800 some million dollars. So if you talk about that, and let's assume it's higher than that, okay? And then you go and you try to dump all that art into the market at once. You can watch those prices plummet from that place. So, you know, it sounded really good, like sell the art and you'll get, selling the art would have been a Band-Aid, even if we wanted to do it with the values that we were going to get out of it by dumping it all on the market at the same time. There were also proposals to, well, just finance it, right? Just hock it up. The art can be collateral, and you can just take out a loan, and you can get $2 billion, $3 billion in loans, and you can hock it up. Okay. With Detroit's track record, I mean, what are the odds it was going to default on that? And given where it came out, given the cash flow projections that ultimately came out, which is, you know, the city's basically break even for the next decade. You know, how is it going to take on another $2 to $3 billion worth of debt? So while the solutions, you know, sound really good if you stick them on a Post-it note and tap them to the wall and put them in a headline, when you get beyond it, as a practical matter, you know, you destroy an art museum for Michigan, not just Detroit, and you really wouldn't get, you know, your bang for your buck out of it.
Let me agree with something Judge Rhodes said and maybe clarify what I meant. I agree that if the city isn't functioning, it can't keep its promises to anybody. And so I agree you have to resolve this case in favor of a functioning city. If the state of Michigan had written a check for $1 billion instead of $200 million, the retirees would have had better pensions than they wound up with and a little more health care. That's just simple arithmetic. And we can debate whether the art would have sold for $1 billion or $3 or something. But again, whatever other resources could have been brought to bear from water and sewer or from art or from the state would have simply meant less pain for some people who were owed money, who were largely retirees. Would have been better treatment for the cops as well. But as I said, 85% of it would have gone to the retirees. So on a go-forward basis, obviously the city could not continue to bear annual pension and health care costs of $300–400 million when it was barely break even from operations, if you will. So that's easy, and I agree with Judge Rhodes. But the decision that Michigan made to not put in, and I'm using the number $1 billion, just means that there's $800 million more pain to the creditors.
Judge Rhodes, let me ask you, when you got the bankruptcy case back in July of 2013, what were your priorities in the case? What were your limitations? And how did that change over the tenure of the trial?
Well, I knew from the very beginning that a mediated settlement would be in the best interest of everyone, and most especially the city. And so my first priority was to recruit the strongest possible mediator I could. So when Judge Rosen told me that he was going to recommend me to the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals for assignment to the case, and then that happened, I asked him if he would be the mediator in the case, because he had the right qualifications, I felt, for that job. And I said before and maintain that that was the smartest thing I did in the case, was to appoint Judge Rosen, because he did a miraculous job in the mediation process. And it is what led to the successful conclusion of the case within the expedited time frame that it was. Beyond that, I've already talked about the political challenges that were faced. These were new and a bit strange to me, because we bankruptcy judges don't normally have to deal with those kinds of political issues. And then in fundamental ways, as I've already discussed, Chapter 9 is different from Chapter 11, and it requires some rethinking, of my role in the case and what my authority was in the case, the limitations of it.
I know there's bankruptcy law. Do you wish it had more authority?
No, I don't. I did not want to be the mayor of the city. I did not want to be the one responsible to decide whether, for example, the art would be sold, or how the priorities would be arranged as among all of the various needs of the city. It is true that to a great and undeniable extent, the appointment of an emergency manager deprived the citizens of their normal democratic process, but I did not want and feel it was appropriate for the filing of the bankruptcy to further erode the democratic rights of these people.
Talk to me about the meditation. Maybe we could all meditate. Maybe you needed some meditation during the process.
There's no time for meditation.
The mediation process. I know, Judge Rhodes, you had said, having not been involved in it, it was something I think you were curious about. I don't know whether Ron or Heather or Vince can talk to us a little bit about.
It should be disclosed that everyone here is subject to a mediation confidentiality order still, and so they are not permitted, in fact, they are prohibited from disclosing anything that happens
It's just
in
for us in this room,
the mediation.
I promise.
Right, with the cameras on it.
Is there anything you can talk about the process?
Well, look, overall...
Was it very heated?
Sometimes, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I was probably one of the few lawyers that was in virtually every subject of mediation. I think there was one that I missed.
Lucky you.
Lucky me. But I have to say that because what we were dealing with was not simply economic, because it was so political, and because there were such fractious, open debates from some of the constituencies for decades prior to filing, if you didn't have the negotiations happen in a mediated session where people who normally wouldn't speak to each other and would be at each other's throats had the comfort of knowing that what they said to the other person in trying to make a deal was confidential. If this had to be done regular negotiation where it was open kimono and the press was reporting on it all the time, I don't think these settlements would have gotten done, period. I mean, I think when you go into a very hotly contested, very political situation, which is something that Chapter 11 people are usually not having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, you have to have a forum that will be conducive to people who normally won't come together, coming together.
So they understood it.
Yeah, and I think that it was a necessary process. And I think mediation, in Chapter 9 is particularly a lot more important than in a normal commercial case for those reasons. So I don't think we would have gotten to where we got to without the mediation process.
Ron or Vince, any thoughts?
Go ahead. Well, I want to go back to something that Ron said, which is true, which was true in Detroit and is true in all distressed municipal situations. And that is the vast majority, by orders of magnitude, of the obligations of a city in distress are labor-related. Pension, OPEB, in some instances, wages under a collective bargaining agreement. And it is the political will to confront that issue that in many respects drives whether or not you're going to be successful in Chapter 9. Because if you don't confront that issue, if you come out without having dealt with those problems in a sustainable way, then you have squandered an opportunity. Yeah. That's sort of a long way of saying the mediation process, I think rightly so, focused on that issue. And I mean, the grand bargain really was the fruit of the mediation process, became the fulcrum around which the plan was built. And I think that although the mediation process ultimately drove deals with the capital markets players, until it had driven a deal with the retirees and the pension funds and the unions, a deal with the capital markets players would not that much have advanced the ball. So it ultimately proceeded in that order. I don't know that it was deliberately that way.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, process-wise, that's how it had to happen and how it ultimately did happen.
Ron, anything?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, again, the numbers were what they were, as I've said earlier. And I also think, for us, I think the value of the mediation was we were able to, on a confidential basis, have very candid conversations with the city and others about what they had in mind and what we thought was reasonable. And the other thing we were able to do is ultimately we chose to support the plan. Back to my earlier point, we persuaded ourselves that the grand bargain represented the limits of the politically possible. And that was really, as I said, for us, that was kind of the judgment. We weren't significantly questioning the revitalization. We weren't significantly questioning the basic operating assumptions, and the treatment of active employees wasn't really in our bailiwick. So from our perspective, it was what is the limits of the politically possible, and the grand bargain was a unique invention of Judge Rosen, but also the odd constellation of political and economic forces in Detroit. And once we had satisfied ourselves that we got that the grand bargain did represent the kind of outside limit of the revenue, of the new revenue, if you will, the kind of one-time revenue. Then after that, while there was a lot of tough sledding, that really allowed us to kind of frame what we thought a fair resolution for our claim would be.
But Ron and Vince, do you think that there could have been something, I mean, Ron, you kind of mentioned a little bit before, but something other than the grand bargain? Could there have been something significantly much better, especially with the clock ticking, everybody watching, a lot of pressure?
See, that's an interesting question. And first of all, Detroit is, to my knowledge, unique in sort of having this potentially highly valuable asset that, if monetized, could have made a material difference in, or if monetized differently or for more money, could have made a material difference in recoveries. There were two what I'll describe as legal impediments to a different treatment of the yard, neither of which got decided, and in fact it's probably fair to say that most of the interesting legal issues in the case never did get decided because of the settlements, and that's not a bad thing.
He says that in anticipation of what my decisions would have been.
There's more than a little truth to that. But with the art,
relief a little bit?
with the art, there were two issues. One was whether the bankruptcy court had the power to direct the city to monetize the art if the city refused to do so. I think the answer is certainly no. If the question is, could the court have entered an order telling the city monetize the art? The answer is not so clear, in my view. If the question was, could the court decline to confirm a plan of adjustment on the basis that the city had this asset, which it was not realizing sufficient value from? I think that's a much closer question, and one that would have been at issue in confirmation had the settlement not occurred. The second issue...
Judge Rhodes, anything you want to share?
Well, I thought I actually did decide that question. I suppose that an argument could be made that it was dicta, but there was a dissenting class of creditors. Now, they didn't object to the plan, but I had to find that all the elements of confirmation were met as to that class, including what Vince is referring to here, the best interest of creditors test. And so in that context, I did address whether failure to account for the art in the distribution to this unsecured creditors class, which was about 10 to 13%, met the best interest of creditors test. And I held that it did for at least a couple of reasons. One was that outside of bankruptcy, there's no procedure for unsecured creditors to have access to the art, really to any asset of the city. There's a process for potentially increasing real property tax revenues, but that's it. Creditors of a municipality may not execute on property of the municipality. And I was never persuaded that an unsecured creditor, that Congress intended for an unsecured creditor to do better inside of a bankruptcy because of this best interest of creditors test than they would outside of bankruptcy. That's very counterintuitive to us in bankruptcy. And so on that basis, I held...
I have thoughts on that when judges
Yeah.
The trial.
I'm so sure. So I held
Sidebar,
that...
please.
I held that despite the city's failure to account for the value of the art in the distribution to unsecured creditors, the best interest of creditors test was met.
Just quickly, because I want to... Go ahead.
Well, on the issue of what would be available to creditors under state law and whether they should do better, I guess there are two quick answers to that. One is if a state makes available to a municipality the ability to file Chapter 9, which it has to affirmatively do, it is relinquishing, in many respects, control over what happens to the liabilities and the assets.
Not the assets. You got 903 and 904.
I'm going to get
We're not going to get into a legal argument up here, but
Yes,
not
we
the
are.
assets.
This is what dinner was like last night. A little bit.
Yes, we are.
And a bankruptcy court is not bound by state law of priorities in terms of distribution to creditors. So it's not clear to me why a bankruptcy court would be bound by state law limitations on execution. The other point is that, yes, it's true that state law doesn't permit execution. And by the way, that's not unique to Michigan. Mm-hmm. That's fairly typically the case. What's fairly typically the case is the remedy is one of mandamus to compel the raising of revenues, taxes. Now, the filing of the bankruptcy takes away a creditor's ability to exercise the remedy it's given under state law. It doesn't seem to me that it's entirely unfair to therefore say, well, you can't take away the one and then argue that the creditors don't have.
What if your remedy is totally ineffective because they're already taxing at the state maximums?
Well, and look.
Which is what we had.
And I have even a better question when you're done answering that.
I'm going to go sit by the pool.
Let me just say that we may have had a battle of the experts over whether or not raising taxes would have raised revenues. That is a fact issue that we never had to get to either, which is probably
Well, it was
But weren't you having
actually it was a
trouble?
legal issue.
Yeah.
What was that?
There was a state taxing limit.
No, I know that.
So my question is, how do you deal with Heather's citation to Section 904, which says the bankruptcy court has no authority over the property of the municipality?
And my answer to that is that, again, while I don't believe, well, doesn't matter what I believe. Well, 904 says that a bankruptcy court cannot affirmatively compel the debtor to do anything with anything. What it can do or decline to do is approve a plan of adjustment. And I think that a court can condition approval on a plan of adjustment on the city doing things that the court can't order it to do, other than to say, if you don't do it, I'm not approving this plan. And I think that's how you would get around to that.
Oh, that's a great 10th Amendment violation. That would go straight up to the Supremes.
Well,
See, all of this is going to be decided in the future, guys.
Okay, so yeah,
No,
but we have the grand bargain, we have the resolution. I want to just maybe go a little bit forward and say, what's the future of Detroit at this point? Because it is what it is. It's come out of bankruptcy. Ron, what do you think the future is for Detroit? Not everything fixed.
Well,
right?
by definition, it's not everything fixed, because as I said when I started, much of what got Detroit into trouble has to do with the economics and the jobs and the economic engine issue. So there's a lot of political dysfunction, but the economic engine issue matters. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think two things have happened which are cause for cautious optimism. One is, I think the political system did come together in a pretty good way. I happen to be a fan, not that I voted for him, I'm not a citizen, but I think the current mayor is a pretty impressive guy. I think the fact that the citizens voted for this guy tells you that they want someone who in a practical, pragmatic way will try to get things done, will try to work constructively with stakeholders, and will try to get beyond some of this old family feuding. I think the complexity of executing is enormous, but the little things that the citizens have done are, to me, good signs. And I think the early steps of the mayor are good signs. And then the other question, which is much harder to predict, is what's the economic opportunity? And right now, the car biz is doing pretty good. And it still is a significant engine in southeastern Michigan, which flows into Detroit in a material way. While the factories are not there, still a lot of people who live in Detroit work in the automobile industry in one place or another. So I think in a time of general economic recovery and the possibility of political renewal, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Judge Rhodes, are you comfortable with the assumptions, the funding assumptions going forward for Detroit?
Yes, I found, based on the record before me, that the plan is feasible, although perhaps marginally so. The balance sheet is fixed. The budgets looked feasible to me going forward. I'm perhaps slightly more optimistic than Ron is. I feel a genuine excitement and enthusiasm around the city regarding its future, and it's contagious, and I've caught it. I do have some concerns that I have expressed. First, beginning down the line, 9 or 10 years down the line, the city will be required to make very substantial contributions again to its pension plans. They're off the hook for this period of time, at least largely off the hook. But beginning in 9 or 10 years, the numbers are quite substantial. The difficulty with pension contributions is that, at least in the past, there hasn't been a strong constituency to advocate their payment. When resources are squeezed, the political process kicks in, and the limited resources get allocated according to that political process. And because there's not a strong constituency for pensions, I'm concerned about whether the will be there to make those contributions. And they are necessary for the plans to become fully funded over a long period of time. So that's one concern. Our current mayor, I agree with the assessment that he's a competent, confident, enthusiastic guy. and is really the major driving force for the enthusiasm about the city that many people feel. Of course, he won't be in office forever, and certainly not for the time it's going to take to do all of the changes that need to be done in order for the city's plan to work in the long term.
And Judge Rhodes, your bigger problem is your concerns about these defined contribution plans and changing them over, or defined benefit plans, excuse me, and switching them over to defined. I mean, you think this is a bigger issue?
I do. I think one of the major things that cities in the zone of insolvency should consider doing is switching from defined benefit pension plans to defined contribution plans. Private America has already figured out to do that, and many cities around the world have also done that. And it's time for American municipalities to consider doing that as well, especially those that are insolvent or in the zone of insolvency. Why? Because for an entity that is insolvent or close to it, they can much less afford the risk of guaranteeing a future pension. Oh, it's politically troublesome, except I think that more and more the unions are recognizing that every current employee is a future retiree. And we have in this country, I've seen estimates between $1 and $4 trillion of unfunded municipal pension liability. Now, in Michigan, we have this constitutional protection against the impairment of pensions. So if this were done in Michigan, it could probably only be done for new employees. But it's an incremental step that over a generation could significantly help to address the risks that municipalities are taking with defined benefit programs.
We just have a few minutes left, and I'd love to just wrap it up and each of you just give some final thoughts, just briefly. Heather, I mean, this is a case study looking at the restructuring of Detroit. Some final thoughts from you.
You know, everybody keeps asking me, is this going to be the model for the future? Is this going to be the model for how you do Chapter 9s? And I think in some ways it is, and in others it won't be. I mean, there was a lot to Detroit that I think is sui generis, that you're not going to find in other places. You're not going to find, you know, this interesting convergence of state and philanthropic money coming in to save an art museum, because most cities don't own art museums. So you're not going to have that. But I do think that as a model for how to proceed in a very hotly charged political environment, I think this will be followed. I think people are going to look at how the mediation process ran here, and how to conduct those kinds of strategic negotiations going forward. So I think it'll serve as that kind of model. I mean, obviously, as was indicated before, there's not a whole bunch of new case law that came out of this because most things were settled. But I think as a process methodology, I think you'll see this in the future.
Ron?
But I think it is a hopeful moment that something this broken can be given a new lease. You know, that's what bankruptcy sort of invented to do, but to do it in a political environment, and again, appreciating how broken the politics were, and the fact that people were able to rise above it and do something, you know, that was reasonable and that gives the city a second chance, I think is a moment for optimism for how we do politics.
But time will tell.
Absolutely.
Vince?
Well, you know, I'm going to refer back to Judge Rhodes' own words in confirming the plan. Toward the end of the judge's supplemental written opinion, in confirming the plan, he says there really is no choice here. And there really wasn't. Ultimately, the problem with cases where there is no choice, is it can leave a tricky legacy. I have hope for Detroit too. If you read the feasibility report done by Judge Rhodes' court-appointed expert, it's sort of like a whodunit, in that as you're reading through, you're not quite sure whether it's going to say feasible or not feasible at the end, and in many respects, by changing a few words, I mean, that's how close it is, I think. But the citizens of Detroit have got their shot. and they need to take it. I am far less sanguine about other cities. Chuck mentioned Stockton. I'm involved in San Bernardino. There was Vallejo in California. I still don't think there's the political will to confront pension obligations the way they need to be confronted, and until that happens, I think if Detroit's a success story, it may be one of the few.
Judge Rhodes, I think it's appropriate. Last word.
One of the lessons that this case reaffirmed for me is that denial is a river in Egypt. Detroit was in denial for many years about its ability to be a vital city. The COPS transaction that Vince defends was a perfect example of that. There may have been some benefit to the city from that COPS transaction, but ultimately, everyone in this room knows that substituting one debt for another without substantial structural changes does not create a path to success. It just doesn't. And the city did that transaction without changing its structure. And so for 30 years, I would drive to Detroit feeling depressed and less hopeful about its ability to revitalize itself. Because as you drive through it, you are confronted daily with the sight of it. And so this case, I'm so grateful, gives me hope for the future of Detroit. For me personally, it was a dream case. For a judge, a dream case is great issues and great lawyers. And we had that in this case. We also had great advisors. And we had success, at least a path to success. So it was a great way for me to end my career.
Thank you, everybody. Grateful very much.